Okay, now that we've talked about the main model of memory, the modal model, I want to take a little bit of time just to take a little bit of a closer look at working memory and talk about some of the big things that you should keep in mind as we continue to go further into this idea of working memory. And to start off, one of the things that I want you to just take a little bit of time to think about is how working memory differs from long-term memory. And we'll do this for each of the different stages of memory as we go through them. But in the case of working memory, one of the big differences between working memory and long-term memory is the size of storage, right? So when it comes to long-term memory, it's amazing the amount of information that we store in memory. We know a lot of facts. We have a lot of episodic memories for events that have happened in our life. There's a ton of information. However, when we compare that to the storage size of working memory is really, really small. In fact, it's really a very limited amount of information that we can keep in working memory, and we actually have to work to keep that information in storage in working memory. As far as ease of entry, it's really easy though to get information into working memory. So if we think back to like the phone number example or something like that, it's really easy to get that phone number into working memory. By contrast, it's a lot harder to get things into long-term memory. So ease of entry is pretty easy. As far as ease of retrieval by and large, also compared to long-term memory, it's relatively easy to retrieve things from working memory. We'll talk about this more specifically as we go on, but it's a little bit more difficult to retrieve information from long-term memory. Now, one of the big things to keep in mind when we compare working and long-term memory, though, is kind of the fragility of working memory. So I keep coming back to this example of the jerky friend that as you're trying to count money or something like that, throws out random numbers at you. And in part because it's an experience we've all had and everybody always thinks it's funny to do to other people. But it really kind of highlights the fragility that we need to keep in mind whenever we're talking about working memory. And working memory is very, very fragile, right? It just takes one little kind of blip or perturbation or something like that in order for working memory to be completely wiped out. In contrast, long-term memory, even though it's more difficult to get information into long-term memory and to retrieve it compared to working memory, that information's in long-term memory, right? Once it's in, it's pretty well in long-term memory. In the case of working memory, it's not, right? It's always in kind of this fragile state that can easily be disrupted at any given moment. So keep this in mind, especially as we kind of branch out over multiple chapters in talking about memory, of what these big differences are between working memory and long-term memory. Specifically in our case, working memory has relatively small storage size. It's a lot easier to get information in than long-term memory. It's also a lot easier to retrieve information. However, kind of with all these pros, there's also the big con of it's really, really fragile. It's easy to kind of wipe out any information that's in working memory. Now, the other thing that I want you to kind of keep in mind and think about as we talk about memory, working memory specifically, is to think about the nature of our world and one of kind of the issues, if you will, that working memory has to deal with. And so when we think about how we get information in the world, there's really kind of two different ways. And probably the more common way is what I'm going to refer to as piece by piece information. And so some really good example of this is language, right? So one of the things that you have to do, and just in order to be able to understand the sentence that I'm saying right now, is to keep all the words that were at the beginning of the sentence in working memory till I get to the end of the sentence so that you can put those words together and really put together the sentence that I'm trying to say and abstract some sort of meaning from it. Probably another good example of this on a much larger time scale is the case of murder mysteries, right? Basically, what ends up happening is a lot of information unfolds. We kind of have to keep that information in our working memory so that we can piece together those individual parts of the puzzle until we get to the end where we can put all those little puzzle pieces together in order to figure out who it was that committed the actual murder. So one of the kind of amazing things about working memory is that we rely on it really, really heavily. especially in things like understanding language and reading, but then also in kind of fun cases like murder mysteries, where basically we just kind of get information piece by piece and have to put it all together in order to be able to achieve whatever our end goal, whether it's understanding what somebody's saying or trying to solve some sort of a mystery. Now, this contrasts with another approach to working memory that isn't as kind of common in the real world, where we get all of our information at once. And maybe some good examples of this are things like the user interfaces in cars or vehicles, where all the information that we need is presented in front of us. And in a lot of ways, we don't even have to really use working memory in order to drive the car. We actually just have all that information presented for us. Or this is a little bit of a dated example where I have the Windows 8 interface, although it, to the best of my knowledge, or at least on my computers, this interface still shows up. But one of the beauties of this particular interface right here is that it basically gives us all the information that we need, right? I can set up to see, okay, what are the tasks that I have to do today? What's the weather like? What are other pieces of information that I need to keep in mind so that I can work most effectively and do what it is that I need to do? Now, even though these types of things are less common where we get all our information at one time, the one thing that I want to point out is that when it comes to like computer interfaces or vehicular control panels or anything like that, is that they've actually kind of been purposely designed so that we don't have to rely on working memory as much. Basically, what it is it's a little trick to help us with working memory, and we do these types of things all the time. For example, if there's an important fact that you always seem to forget, right, you write it on a Post-it note next to your computer screen or whatnot, and then you have that information. So you don't actually have to keep it in memory, but you actually come up with some sort of a design approach in order so that you have that memory readily available whenever you need it. A lot of work has actually gone into designing cars, computer interfaces, and a lot of other things, where it basically kind of tries to take working memory and make that not as difficult of a goal for us, right? It tries to present us with all the all the information that we need in a readily available state so that we can see it and not really have to rely on working memory, or some might say ease cognitive processes in order to be able to do a particular task. And so as we talk about this, I kind of want you to keep two things in mind. And also as we continue to talk about working memory, of the piece by piece versus all at once nature that we get information from the world and how that might interact and affect memory systems. But then the other thing that I want you to keep in mind are there ways that we're kind of designing things so that we can basically kind of override working memory, so we don't have to at least put as much effort into working memory and keep things in our information. We don't have to work with it to keep it in mind as we're trying to make decisions. And this is actually one of the great things that designers have been using, and this is kind of a nice applied element of cognitive science of basically trying to ease the burden of working memory. So hopefully that was some important tidbits in order for you to kind of understand a little bit more about working memory, and hopefully give you some food for thought as you're thinking about some of these things. But if you have any questions or anything like that, definitely feel free to ask either through the parking lot forum, or feel free to drop me an email so that I can answer your questions more specifically.